Alright guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about this. A Bruger Entombment, hereafter referred to as B&T because I don't want to keep butchering the pronunciation of the name. GHM9 chambered in 9mm. This is our latest in the Friendly Fire series, a series in which I review guns out of my friends' collections in order to remove my personal purchase bias, as well as discuss guns and setups that I may not necessarily jump to right off the bat. Actually, I really love it whenever it is that I get a chance to do an episode like Friendly Fire. The channel's not supported by anybody. I don't get sent guns for T&E or, review or anything along those lines. So I have to rely on the charity of people who know me to provide me guns for review whenever it is that, I want to break from reviewing my collection. All right, so with that being the case, before this is all said and done, we will discuss whether or not I would buy this and what changes I would make. Now, something else I want to go ahead and point out right off the bat before we get too far into, this gun. This is a pistol, not a rifle. This is a brace, not a stock. We'll talk about that more once we get into features. But before we do all that, I want to go ahead and get into a little bit of background because this is not a terribly historic firearm. B&T as a company are well known for their PCCs, or pistol caliber carbines, producing a wide variety of them. They would actually make their fame with the APC9, which would be picked up by several European law enforcement agencies. They are a Swiss manufacturer, if you didn't know that. See, we even got a Swiss emblem here on the side. Now, the GHM9 would come out in 2017 to compete on the civilian market against the likes of the CZ Scorpion, SIG MPX, so on and so forth. In fact, the acronym GHM stands for grasshopper mouse, which, for those of you who don't know, the grasshopper mouse is a small rodent native to the American Southwest that is known for eating scorpions. This is supposed to be a tongue-in-cheek reference to this being a scorpion killer. We'll talk about that more once we get into competitive offerings. Now, this gun has gone into two different generations. We have the Generation 1, of which this gun is a member, and then we have the Generation 2. Our conversation is going to kind of bridge across those two options. Like, yes, obviously I have to make recommendations based off of this being a Gen 1. However, we're going to infer or reflect upon the Gen 2 quite a bit because it is still in production. The Gen 1 is not. We'll talk about some differences as we go. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers background. Why don't we go ahead and get into the features of this particular firearm. Right off the bat, we have a 6.9-inch barrel. Nice. These are produced in this length or in 4.3 for the K variants. I actually prefer this little bit longer barrel. And that is because if I'm going to run a PCC, I want to have more barrel length than what I would have in a handgun. And if you look at a lot of designs out there, it's like the really successful ones like the MP5, even like my 9mm SPR, those are running 8.3-inch barrels. You get a little bit more velocity, which it's still the general opinion on the channel that handgun cartridges are ineffective fight stoppers. But if I can go ahead and get myself a positive relationship with better velocity, I will take that option. An important thing to remember, though, is that there's a trade-off whenever it comes to velocity versus weight and length. At every cartridge, at some point, it hits a point where the barrel is no longer imparting that much more velocity, and now you're just adding weight and length. When we're talking about a PCC, I want something that's nice and compact, but not only do I want a little bit more velocity, I want a little bit more handguard to be able to hang on to be able to like drive that muzzle from target to target in order to be able to help me manage recoil and really hammer home those hits and all those types of things. So I'm a big fan of this length. Now, whenever it comes, or this barrel comes with a 1/2x28 threaded muzzle, which would normally have a little protective cap on it, and then also a tri-lug adapter. So this gun has three different options that you can run if you're wanting to put a suppressor on here. Option A, you go direct thread with a 1/2x28, which a lot of guys who have like 9mm suppressors probably have 9mm handguns, so they're already running direct thread. It's really easy for that to be able to pass back and forth between those options. Option B, you go with the tri-lug adapter. I'm a big fan of the tri-lug because it gives you more consistent lockup and less possibility of there being some sort of impact to your zero, as well as it's very classic. The MP5s ran the tri-lug. That's just very nostalgic in that case. And then option C is that you can use that 1/2x28 to be able to add whatever muzzle device that you use for whatever 9mm suppressor you might be out there running. I'm willing to bet that that's less likely to happen on a 9mm like PCC or any handgun, any PCC in general, but that is an option that's available to you. The owner decided to go with option D, which is none of the above, and instead installed this 4-prong flash hider right here. which does give you a little bit of a tuning fork effect whenever it is that you let the bolt slam home and when gun's firing and all those types of things. But I am a big fan of flash hider, so I don't mind a 4-prong flash hider for sure. All right, let's go ahead and come back and talk about this handguard. Something I want to point out to you guys, because we're about to get hot and heavy in some of the features and stuff like that here. I filmed this video last week, actually, but then decided that there's some things that I wanted to change and wound up not posting it. That was a 40-minute long run through. I have a feeling this is going to be pretty close to that same length. And that's because we have quite a few features that require a lot of conversation. So if I'm dragging through any particular portion of this video, go ahead and check out the description where I have chapters laid out so you can jump to information and content that you want to consume. All right, so this handguard. We have a monolithic Picatinny rail across the top of the gun and across the bottom, as well as M-LOK attachment points that have pick rails installed into them. So we have lots of attachment options when it comes to the setup. Let's go ahead and get into this light. This light is going to be a deep dive, that's for sure, because I have considered doing this type of light setup, but have generally opted against it. So we're going to get to discuss the pros and cons of this particular setup as opposed to what I would normally do. All right, so this is a Surefire X300 Vampire, which has the XT00 plug adapter in order to be able to run this Unity mod light button. And all of this is attached to a Haley Strategic Thorntail, the short setup, running off of this pick rail here. All right, guys, we have a lot to discuss here, starting off with this X300. I have often considered putting pistol lights on these these really short PCC type setups because you're generally going to be engaging the same distances that you would engage with a handgun. The only thing that changes with a PCC, or in this case a pistol, 3 points of contact pistol, as I like to refer to it as, is that you get an additional point of contact. So you could take a more accurate distance shot if you needed to. But this light is going to provide you plenty for the close range niche that I personally feel these types of firearms fit into. You're not engaging at 200 meters. You could still get PID out to that distance, but I'm expecting that this is a gun that's primarily going to be running inside of structures, lighting up rooms and stuff like that. This is more than enough light for that purpose. What I find interesting is that lengthwise, this is very comparable to a Streamlight ProTac or a Surefire M300. However, it's a little bit wider because our batteries are stacked side to side instead of in line. So this kind of complicates the compact pursuit. I have run pistol lights on long guns before. My IWI Galil Ace Gen 1, the original setup I had on that was a knockoff Streamlight. And then on my pistol grip only shotgun, my Sears Model 200, both of these guns previously reviewed on the channel and update reviewed for the IWI Galil Ace, links in the description. I still run a Streamlight TLR3 on the PGO. So I have experimented with the setup. And well, at this point, the Galil Ace is on its third iteration of light setup, but I very quickly went away from that on the Galil Ace, and I haven't really messed with it too much on the PGO because I honestly don't use the pistol grip only shotgun that often. So this light has some benefits that those lights did not. Specifically, those lights have very large and very easy to operate and manipulate paddles on them, which I would frequently get unintentional light activation in the process of transporting or handling and all those types of things. This setup still has its paddles, however, they are very much so contoured into the shape of the light, and they're rather stiff. They're not terribly obtrusive, they're not super easy to snag on things, so I've been carrying this gun for over a month in my backpack. I took out my 9mm SBR and I threw this thing in as part of my EDC setup, and I have not pulled this thing out and ever had this light activated. So it's not sitting around burning up battery or burning up the bulb or anything along those lines. So this has not been an issue. In this case, I would not consider this to be a credible projected problem for this particular light setup. Now, this being the Vampire, this does have white light and IR settings, and the owner does have MVG, so he would be able to take advantage of these things. Now, something to keep in mind, if you're going to run this for a dedicated IR type setup, I would prefer to see some sort of laser designator so that you have, and then of course also an optic that works with NB so that you can have a passive and active means of being able to aim. Going in close range setups, going off of just the beam, the IR beam with this particular setup, you would be able to engage in what I refer to as low probability shooting, which means that I'm not using a sight or any form of normal aiming in order to be able to conduct my engagement. Now, I'm not a big fan of defaulting to low probability shooting, especially when you're talking about if you're running something so niche as a night vision setup gun or a night vision equipped gun. So that's something to take into consideration there. All right, so we have the ability also to put this into an off position by lifting the bezel and rotating it. Now we're in off, which turns the light off, of course. And then we can rotate over to IR. We're not going to spend too much time talking about IR setups. It's very tempting to do so. However, that's like a whole video by itself whenever it is that you're running NB. Now on this XT00, we also have a toggle switch, which also deactivates the light. Now, Murph, what is the probability of that toggle switch getting hit? Well, guys, I can tell you that, again, carrying this over a month, I did not have that toggle switch get knocked at all. And if truth be told, I didn't even know it was there until I started like rehearsing for the review of this particular setup. All right, let's go ahead and talk about the Unity mod light button. Longtime viewers of the channel know that I'm not the biggest fan of pressure pads because of the increased possibility of a negligent discharge of light. And when you're talking about some tactical situations, a negligent discharge of light can be just as disastrous as a negligent discharge of a firearm. So this is why I don't necessarily opt for these types of setups, but I do have setups that have pressure pads on them. This is a momentary setup. It does not have any ability to go to like constant on. I don't know if this would work with like any of your strobing functions or anything along those lines. Didn't look into it. It's not something that's terribly applicable to this particular light. If you want to go to constant on for whatever reason, you have to go over to your toggle switch. So from a tactical standpoint, having a momentary only switch does make some sense. However, I do like that I have the ability that if I wanted to just continue to flood, I can. All right, let's go ahead and talk about this thorntail mount. We have a bit of a Picatinny inception going on here. So we have an M-LOK rail that has a pick rail mounted onto it that then has a Picatinny thorntail mount, which provides a 45-degree offset mounting, a Picatinny mounting surface to be able to attach RX300. Longtime viewers of the channel might have heard me talk about this Picatinny inception before. Here recently, I've been trying to eliminate that type of setup in my tactical rifles and guns in general because I don't want to incorporate that many opportunities for there to be a point of failure. Now, I am fully confident in the owner of this weapon that he's capable of putting it together in such a manner that the proper torque specs have been kept and that it's not necessarily going to fail anywhere along the way. But we introduced the possibility by having so many connecting points. That's one of the things that I like about running actual rifle lights on my setups, which is why I have that on my SPR, is because I can remove the Picatinny mount that most lights come with, and then I can attach something that'll get the light at the position that I want it and integrate with whatever rail section already exists. So we'll talk about that more later, but we do have, let it be known that there's a Picatinny inception going on here. Now, let's go ahead and talk about this True North Concepts grip stop. Longtime viewers of the channel might have heard me talk about how I'm not a big fan of angled foregrips, and this is most definitely what this is, and especially on short setups. I'm not a fan of angled foregrips. Travis Haley talks about how on shorter setups, you're going to want a more vertical type of grip in order to be able to build your grip in such a manner that it doesn't put a bunch of tension on your wrist. And I feel that for sure. That's why I'm not a big fan of angled foregrips, and I run vertical grips on everything I can. However, with this being a pistol, you cannot put a vertical foregrip on here because then it turns it into an NFA item, either an AOW or an SBR. You take your pick. So that's why you have to wind up going with angled foregrips. However, this angled foregrip, already on a vertical grip, I still build an angled grip. Like I cram my fingers up against the, in the corner of the rail and the vertical grip make. And my hand is in that same position on this setup. So I'm still chicken winging a little bit, but my wrist is not super uncomfortable. So I actually really like this grip stop, and whenever it is that I build out or buy a 3 points of contact pistol like this one, I'm absolutely buying this. I'm a huge fan. In addition to that, where the owner has it set, my thumb funnels behind the mod light button, making it a very low probability of me accidentally functioning this light. Huge fan of that setup, very much so appreciate that. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about this optic. This optic is going to be another little bit of a rabbit hole here. This is a Trijicon RMR Type 2 on an American Defense Manufacturing mount attached to a Unity riser. Now, once again, I have considered doing like RMRs or MRDS and stuff like that on different types of like PCCs. I've considered that for those types of builds whenever it is that I'm planning out potential future builds and all those types of things. Generally, I go away from it because I like having a larger viewing window. I like having a larger optic window. So that's why I run differently. I'm trying really hard to not compare this to my 9mm AR9 SBR, unless you guys want to see that, in which case you should let me know. All right. The RMR is a fantastic optic. They are renowned for the ability to be able to take a licking and keep on ticking, just like a Timex. And they are a industry standard for the last decade. So that is a good choice there. We do have another Picatinny inception going on here where we have the Unity rail, this Unity riser, mounted to this, and then the optic mounted to the ADM plate here. I do agree with getting this optic up higher, because if you just did the ADM, you would really have to crush your face down onto the setup in order to be able to get to that optic. So I do like this being up higher. And higher optics have been more and more popular in the industry, where you're able to keep your head more upright and have an easier time bringing the optic to your eyes, as well as it being easier to run with NVGs. At the time that the owner put this together, I don't think there were as many options out there to be able to get the higher optic relief or a higher position on your optic. So he kind of wound up being shoehorned into doing this type of thing. Now you would be able to get a mount that would take your Trijicon RMR and get it at whatever height it is that you want to, eliminating this Unity middle ground. So that's something to consider there. Now, does this achieve the goal of being compact? Well, with the riser on there, the optic height is probably pretty similar to if you ran, T1 or a T2 or, Holosun AEMS or something along those lines. But one of the things that I appreciate about it is that it's very slim. It doesn't much exceed the width of the receiver. It does a little bit with our QD mount right here, but it's not bad overall. It's not like a big block on top. If you threw like an EOTech or something like that up here, you'd definitely have like a lot of overlap spilling over the sides. So this does a very good job of still remaining fairly compact. And we'll talk about this more once we get into shooting as well. Now, this setup does take a bit of a ding because we do not have iron sights on this. And longtime viewers of the channel know that I'm a huge fan of iron sights on your fighting type setups. Having some sort of backup sighting system. Doesn't have to be iron sights. It would be kind of weird to have like an offset red dot on this one, but it could be a laser or something to give you the ability to be able to aim. So once again, we find ourselves having to default to low probability shooting, to where you're like just looking through the window or looking directly over top of the optic or something along those lines in order to be able to make close range engagements. Not the biggest fan of defaulting to low probability shooting as previously stated. So I would like to see some flip up irons. We'll talk about that more once we get into whether or not I would buy it. All right, guys. That's our optic and its setup. Let's go ahead and get into the guts of this gun real quick, because it's actually quite interesting. So, this has retained pins, which I'm, of course, a huge fan of. And I forgot to bring anything down here to be able to punch these, so now I'm trying to grab these with my non-existent nails. Mistakes were made. You know what? Improvise. All right, guys. Lower. And then we have a butt cap back here. So regardless of whether or not you have a brace or a stock, you'll still have some sort of cap. And you have to pop this pin here. And then you kind of got to like rock this off. And you got to be really careful because there is some spring tension going on here for the recoil system. And you can potentially shoot this across the room. Ha, ha, ha. I didn't do it that time though. All right, so you can see here we have a dual recoil spring system. Our charging handle rotates so that we can pull it out. And then our bolt drops free. Now, most of your PCCs are blowback operated systems, which means that you have a big old heavy bolt that keeps the chamber sealed up until pressure's dropped to a point that you're not going to have an out of battery detonation and you won't have like super crappy extraction. A lot of blowback operated designs have some modification to the blowback. 99% of PCCs out on the market are blowback operated. A much smaller percentage of them have something done in order to be able to mitigate one of the disadvantages of a blowback operated system, which is this big heavy bolt moving back and forth. It causes a lot of recoil, not necessarily like, oh, bruise your shoulder recoil, but disturbance to your sights because it's crashing to the rear and it's crashing back into battery. So the most famous example of mitigating that with your blowback principle is roller delayed blowback in your like MP5s and stuff like that, which are a fantastically soft recoiling system. Then you have CMMG coming out with its radial delayed blowback, which I've never tried out, but I can imagine also assists with that. B&T went a different direction and instead put a buffer on the rear of the bolt so that this, as the bolt comes back, compresses its springs, and then it compresses this buffer in order to cushion the blow to the rear, and then it flies back forward and clunks into position in battery. We'll talk about this more once it is that we get into shooting. I will tell you one thing about this though. One of the effects that I notice from having a bolt like this is that whenever I pull the charging handle to the rear, I can feel that spring compressing and I feel like I'm not bringing the bolt all the way to the rear. It's just a kind of weird ism thing that I noticed. Now, something else to go ahead and call attention to on this receiver is on the back here, we have a laser engraving of a grasshopper mouse eating a scorpion. So there's your obligatory reference to this being the quote-unquote scorpion killer. All right, let's go ahead and talk about this lower real quick. You can get a couple different styles of lower, and this is indicative, if this were full auto, this would be indicative of a Gen 3 submachine gun with metal and plastic being utilized. Now, this version is the proprietary magazine version. You can also get this in Glock mags and SIG P320 mags. I don't know why some manufacturers are trying to make SIG P320 mags a thing. They are way more expensive than Glock magazines, and Glock has so much more aftermarket support. Like, I don't understand why anybody would choose a P3. Like, first off, not a big fan of P320 to begin with. Your own little personal flashbang. But I don't know why you would feel a need to want to pair those things. I mean, I guess it makes sense if you bought a P320, but there was your first mistake. All right, so let's go ahead and get this bad boy back together so we can continue to discuss the features. Now we can start getting into the actual controls on this setup. Okay. Now, the charging handle on this system is reversible. It is reciprocating. However, with the installation of that grip stop, there's really no reason that that should ever be an issue for you. Specifically because the only way it could be a problem is if you came back and were holding on to the magwell, and I'm not a big magwell guy. The owner installed the B&T folding charging handle on this particular setup, which I'm a huge fan of. And of course, since I'm a right-handed shooter, I have the charging handle on the left side. This is an incredibly ambidextrous gun. Our bolt release, located right here, is ambidextrous. I have to say that this was something that was kind of weird about the manual arms of this particular gun. I kept wanting to come to the bolt release to be my magazine release, which it is not. Now, this will not lock the bolt to the rear. That is done by this button located between the trigger guard and the magwell. And a similar setup to the Beretta ARX, which I'm really sad the ARX didn't catch on better. I actually kind of liked it. So that's how you lock the bolt to the rear, and then that button only locks the bolt to the rear. Also being ambidextrous with the central location. And then you can hit the bolt release in order to be able to get around into battery. Our magazine release is also ambidextrous. I find the magazine release to be a little indistinct on the release. I also found that when seating magazines in this gun, like loaded magazines, you kind of have to be a little rough with them in order to be able to actually get them to lock into place. So something to keep in mind. And I even ran this with like downloaded magazines, and I noticed that to be the case. All right, the owner installed this B&T jet funnel magwell, which I've got to be completely honest, guys, I didn't really spend a lot of time doing mag changes and stuff like this with this gun outside of like sitting on my couch. I didn't go to the range and do any like one reload ones out of abundance of caution for these magazines. We'll go ahead and talk about this. These are the B&T proprietary magazines. We can see they are translucent, they are numbered, and they do not have any type of metal reinforcement. So it's a plastic magazine with no type of metal reinforcement. And these are not cheap. So I was very much so concerned about potentially damaging this magazine and having to buy the owner a new magazine. So guys, keep in mind, when I review guns from my friends, I take the utmost care that I can of them. I treat them as well, if not better, than my own firearms. I don't do destructive testing. I'm definitely not going to do destructive testing on somebody else's property. This is someone's hard-earned money right here. I'm not going to mess with that. And same thing with these magazines. Now, the owner has added these B&T bumpers onto the bottom of these magazines to make sure that they fall weighted downwards so that it lands on the bumper and decreases the probability of damaging these feed lips. However, I'm not going to run that risk. I ran drills that didn't involve reloads. So magwell, the mag funnel helps, but I really didn't get a whole lot of opportunity to take advantage of that. All right, our trigger. Our trigger is a two-stage trigger, also ambidextrous. And let's see. So here we are on the wall, very stiff wall. It's very much so a mil-spec trigger. I find the release to be a little vague. It's there, and the wall's very stiff and all that kind of stuff, so it's not like I don't know that we're about to hit release, but I find the reset to be much stronger than the release. It's very tactile. I can feel it in my finger, so tactile, audible reset, all that kind of stuff. But the trigger is not necessarily anything to write home about. I don't feel like it holds the gun back either, though. Our safety is an ambidextrous setup. And I am not the biggest fan of ambidextrous safeties. I'm going to be completely honest with you guys. And a lot of you who've been on the channel for a while have heard me talk about this. So my issue with this safety is that the offside, being that both are the same size, they are full-size safeties, irritates my grip. It's very uncomfortable. So not the biggest fan of the safety. It's also rather stiff. Keep in mind, guys, my early training around like tactical rifles and stuff like that involved single side safeties. So even doing like shoulder transition and stuff like that, operating a single side safety comes very naturally to me. I frequently default to that to begin with. So I don't really find ambidextrous safeties to be all that helpful. They're nice. They're just also not that nice. All right, let's go ahead and talk about this grip. I don't get really broken up about grips save for two things. One, if it's like a popsicle grip like you get on some AKs, don't really much care for that. So like it's just, there's almost nothing to hang on to. And then two, if there's an A2 bump, which will irritate my grip, and I generally Dremel off A2 bumps. This grip is neither, so it's just fine in my book. We do have a compartment in here in order to be able to carry things. The owner has some batteries in here. I do the same type of thing, and it's always a great place to be able to have, the opportunity to be able to carry your Skittles with you as well. Okay, that's the lower. Why don't we go ahead and talk about the sling setup? We have a single point sling run to a bit of 550 that passes through the rear sling swivels. We only have rear sling swivels on this gun. There are no provisions for a forward sling swivel. And they're the small kind of hook setups like HK used to use. I am not the biggest fan of single point slings. We'll talk about that more once we get into shooting. They don't not make sense. Bit of a double negative, but it'll be okay. On PCCs, I just don't love it. And we'll talk about why once we get into shooting and handling and all that kind of stuff. All right, let's go ahead and talk about our brace. This is the Gearhead Works tail hook. It is a pistol brace, not a stock. It is made of metal. This does hinge open in order for you to be able to use your forearm as a stabilizer if you wish to do so. It has 4 positions. See? Multiple options for length. The ATF has gone back and forth on their classification of braces over the years. Here, most recently, their official ruling was that a brace constituted stock and you had to SBR everything. However, that seems to have been struck down in the courts, and braces are back to being available not only on guns, but in stores in general, and not on SBRs. So, this is a pistol. This is a brace. We'll get into the brace more once we get into shooting. I have some feelings on braces that we'll discuss here more in a bit. Actually, we're going to discuss it right now. And that's features. How does it shoot? .49 miss. .50 best. All right, guys, I actually got to spend a lot of time with this thing out on the range, and I have some notes. So started off shooting this thing. I got it zeroed in because the owner did mention that it had been a while since it had been zeroed, and he had, like, changed elevation and all those types of things. So that zero needed to be verified. Verified 0, and then I immediately took this thing out to 50 yards and started working over my steel. And I was doing a pretty good job of not missing a beat. I threw a few shots every now and again, but for the most part, I was able to work my steel pretty effectively. So out to 50 yards, which is a pretty reasonable engagement distance with a 9mm, I wouldn't necessarily want to default to going much further. Now, something else I just thought of that I forgot to mention before, guys. In the Gen 1, these were produced in 40 and 45. In the Gen 2s, you'll only find these in 9mm and 45. All right, now, next after that, I started running some 10-shot drills, really working on that recoil management and driving those sights and all that kind of thing. This gun is very easy to control. I definitely feel that that buffer is doing its job, and if I had to rate it, you'd have straight blowback like my AR9 at one end, right? So my AR9 is not the harshest recoiling of guns, but it's not the lightest either. There's definitely a little bit more movement in the sights. I don't consider it to really hold me back. I consider that gun to be very fast, but if I run that up against like an MP5, an MP5 is a far superior recoil operated system. This falls in somewhere in between. So I would consider that buffer to be benefit added, and I would definitely consider that to be a positive attribute of this particular setup, of this little gun. So running it on those 10-shot strings, I had no real issue with being able to keep it nice and controlled. The bigger issue that I ran into, and this happens a lot with my steel, is that I'm shooting swinging steel. So as it starts to dance, I sometimes wind up like I squeeze the trigger when it's in my sight, and by the time the shot breaks, it's rotated a little bit in such a manner that it allows the round to be able to pass by. So a lot of times I have to slow down my shooting cadence whenever it is that I get onto my steel. So I was doing the same thing with 5-shot drills here today, and I had to tangibly slow down in order to be able to make the hits on the steel. And that's fine. That's something that I need to work on. Is, you know, it's great. My sight is there and it's remaining where the target is supposed to be, but actually reading that target and shooting it in an appropriate cadence to be able to continue to pepper it with hits. Not everything has to be done fast, but everything does have to be done accurately. And this is a case if you can't miss fast enough. All right, then I did some ready ups with this gun. So this is where I have a little bit of an issue with braces. A lot of people like to sit around and talk about how a brace is basically a stock and it's some sort of cheat code to not have to have an SPR. I conditionally disagree. Yes, I get an additional point of contact and it does really help me out with my engagements and all those types of things. However, this version is more stable than like your SPA3s and all those other, you know, those rubber options. This is more stable than that. However, I find that getting my cheek weld that coming up onto the sight is not the most consistent. A lot of this might have to be with the skeletonized nature of this brace setup. So in general, like, you know, I have an underfolder AK. That feels weird whenever it is that I mount it. And I kind of get the same feeling from this. And that's something that you just have to accept when you're talking about, you know, skeletonized stocks like this. Underfolder or whatever it is that it may be. When you've got these two rails going right here, they are not as easy to achieve that repeatable cheek weld and all that kind of stuff. Or if you're coming up on the gun real fast, you may have some issues with getting into your pocket and all those types of things. This is where, in general, if you're talking about a conventional AR stock, it is better than any spring type or, you know, rail type underfolder, let alone these types of telescoping braces and or stocks. So something to keep in mind there as far as like general impressions that I've had from shooting. But grabbing the dot was not too difficult once I kind of got consistent contact with this brace. That was just something I had to work through. I will say that receiving the setup for review definitely motivated me to go ahead and set up the SMG version of my kit setup, which I just had to remove the AR mag insert and then put in and then put in my SMG mag insert. Just barely. Reliability was 100%. I had absolutely no issues with this weapon system, but let's go ahead and talk about this sling. Single points are really convenient whenever it is that you're running drills or doing like shoulder transitions and stuff like that. They're super great for that. The moment you have to do anything else, they are a pain. Like walking around and stuff like that, this thing is going to bounce against you the entire time unless you have a hand on it constantly, keeping it more stiff, as opposed to a 2-point sling that you can just like let ride. And then for the most part, it's pretty much out of your way. This thing's constantly either bouncing against your groin or your knee. Now, I could set it up on my kit in order to be able to funnel it kind of down along my legs so it wasn't bouncing into my groin, but it was still hitting against my knee the entire time. So that's kind of annoying. I have single point setups on my guns as well, especially because like a lot of those slings I got for free, and I'm not going to turn down a free sling, and I'm going to use a free sling. But I am actively replacing those slings on those guns because like it was great. They got them off the bench and in the fight, but now it's time to update. All right, do I have anything else to cover from shooting? No, nothing else comes to mind. All right, so with that, why don't we go ahead and get into the recommendations portion of this video. Would I recommend this for duty type use? No. And that's purely because of the iron sights. If this thing had iron sights on it, this would be not a resounding yes, because I still feel that PCCs have very niche duty requirements, but it wouldn't be a no either. It would just be identifying that, like, yes, if you're doing a lot of very confined space type stuff, this would be a really great option. I think of this a lot whenever it comes to like boats. If you're doing boat entry, I could see a PCC being advantageous for that type of role. But if you're talking about like being a patrol officer, I would not necessarily default to a PCC, even if it did have iron sights on it. Okay, what about home defense, self-defense? This is going to sound kind of weird, guys, but no, because of the iron sights. But Murph, isn't that a little hypocritical? You've been carrying this gun as part of your EDC. Correct. I had to do it for the gram, man. I had to make sure that, I had lots of data and stuff like that. No, guys, I really enjoy shooting this gun. I feel very confident working around this gun. I feel very confident being able to fight with this gun. That's fine for me, but I have to think about things more three-dimensionally whenever it is that I'm making recommendations to you guys. So based off of my long-standing belief that defensive type arms need to have iron sights, this thing needs to have iron sights. Now, if it did have iron sights, then yes, this would be a great truck option. This would be a great home defense option, confined space type of thing. If you're in a position where you can't just cover your door, you have family members that you might have to go secure in the case of a home invasion, this would be a fantastic little CQB option. So with those things taken into consideration, I wish we had some iron sights. Okay, what about as a competition gun? Kind of depends on the competition. I actually wanted to take this to IDPA last weekend. However, I wound up going to a wedding instead, which, can't be too mad about it because I was the best man. So I had responsibilities, but I was really hoping to be able to run this in IDPA because it does have a PCC division. Now, if you're talking about running 3-gun or something along those lines, if you're going to be shooting out beyond 50 yards, this would not be my first choice. Maybe 100 yards, but if your 3-gun matches have you shooting out to like 300 or something along those lines, no, I would not recommend this for that type of competition use. But if you're doing like, 2-gun action matches or, what do they call it? Renegade matches, then yes, this would be great. You could get out there if this were your defensive option and run it in those types of defensive situations and all that kind of stuff and really vet your system and get used to it. All right, what about as a hunting gun? No, I don't recommend 9mm for any type of hunting. I know you could use it on like small game. I just don't think it's a good choice. And then from there, what about as a woods gun? Well, it's more compact than a lot of options that you could take. And I could see this being helpful on like a property that's fairly large and you might be concerned about poachers or something along those lines. But I would not take this as an option against bears or any other type of dangerous game. This wouldn't be what I would use as a backup gun for a guide gun or something along those lines. So I would not necessarily recommend it in that capacity. All right, Murph. Would you buy it and what changes would you make? I would not buy a Gen 1, which this is. Why would I not buy the Gen 1? Because the Gen 1s are known for not being able to cycle hollow points. I would buy a Gen 2. So, do with that what you will. What changes would you make then, Murph? Well, I would change the slide setup. I would probably run like a ProTac or something along those lines. Maybe a Surefire M300, whatever. I would run some sort of rifle light, and I would set it up to be able to run probably off of the M-Lock rail. Okay, I would add iron sights, of course. I would maybe keep this optic. I'm not necessarily against this optic. I think this thing performed just fine, but I would go with a one-piece mount that gets it to the height that I want it. I would keep the flared magwell. I would keep the folding charging handle. I'd even keep the brace because it would be nice to have a 3 points of contact pistol because it opens up some options whenever it is that it comes to EDC as well as traveling. The biggest change that I would make is I would go with the Glock Mag compatible version of this because there are two things that increase my interest in a PCC. One is being able to have this small, light, compact setup, and two is that it runs off of handgun magazines that I'm probably already fighting with. So I would prefer to see Glock mags as opposed to these rather expensive proprietary magazines. That way, if I'm out bebopping around and I have like my Glock 19 with me, I can use my Glock 19 mags to keep this gun in the fight and vice versa. Whichever direction it is that I need to go with that ammunition, I have that interchangeability at that point. So that would be my preference there. Now, as an EDC type setup, with this telescoping stock, this does get fairly small. My SBR has a side folding setup on it and gets smaller than this setup does. However, I cannot fire my SBR from that folded position. I can fire this thing from its compressed position. So if I just fish this out of my backpack, I could rock and roll like this if the threat were that close, were that problematic. And then I can get this brace out to the length that I need in order to be able to take those more precise shots, drive that muzzle, all those types of things. So there's some very tangible benefits to this particular arrangement. Everything is a balance of pros and cons, guys. So that's what we have to keep in mind with this. So with that, why don't we go ahead and talk about competitive options. Is this the Scorpion killer? That is a very difficult question to answer. One of the biggest and most tangible benefits of the CC Scorpion is cost. It's one of the cheaper PCCs on the market that is also still good. In addition to that, the Scorpion has cheaper magazines. So there's a lot of very tangible benefits with going with the Scorpion. I don't know if I call this a Scorpion killer. I do think this might be a killer to something more like an MPX, which is comparable but probably more in price than this particular gun is. And this has very tangible, it has that buffer spring on the bolt and all that kind of stuff to be able to help with recoil. I would consider this to be a killer to anything at its price point or more expensive. Whereas I think the CZ manages to squeak by with its price point alone. Now, I'm not necessarily comparing this to an MPX because how does this compare to an MP5? Which, guys, if you saw my PTR9 CT review, which if you're interested in that, go ahead and check out the link in the description. You know that I have an absolute soft spot for the MP5 and its variants. I really do. They are fantastic guns. They are also incredibly expensive for the most part. There are some cheaper options out there, but they're still kind of at the upper end of the price point when it comes to PCCs. At best, they're kind of around that like middle ground, while having the least efficient manual of arms that they can, while being incredibly problematic in practical application. So I would consider this to only lose to an MP5 in the form of nostalgia, because having said all of that, I would take up an MP5 and its many variants in a heartbeat. Because I can't help it. It's just cool. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting. That's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.